Thank you, Stephen. Hi, I'm Penny Pennington. I'm an alcoholic, and I'm grateful to be here. I want to thank Stephen for asking me to come and do this evening, and I want to say hi to all of the friends that I recognize on the screen, and thank you for your ongoing support and showing up even when you've heard my story before. I walked into my first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous on Sunday, October 9th, 1977, and since that time, I've not used or abused alcohol or any other substance that allows me to take a trip without leaving my chair unless I'm on Zoom. And last October, I celebrated 43 years of continuous sobriety in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I did not mean to stay sober that long. It was really not part of my plan. I came in here because I was dying. And as my friend Whiskey Bill used to say, I got here the day before I died. So I'm grateful to be here. I have a sponsor. My sponsor has 57 years of sobriety. I talk to my sponsor every Thursday morning at 8:30. I have a day and a time to talk to my sponsor. And I love that at 43 years of sobriety, I'm still doing that on a weekly basis. I often talk with her more frequently, but I'm always on the phone with her at 8:30 on Thursdays. And for me, I asked Peg to be my sponsor when I had just before my 19th AA birthday. And when she told me she'd sponsor me, she laid out the rules, and she said, and one of the things is I want you to call me once a week, and this time works for me. So your time is Thursdays at 8:30. And the thought I had was, excuse me, I am 19 years sober. I do not need to call my sponsor once a week. But she had also just asked me if I was willing to follow directions. So I didn't think it was a good time to say, well, I'm not going to follow that one. And, but I had a plan. Of course, I had a plan. I was going to call her for a while, and then I'd just kind of forget, and then she'd kind of forget. And then I know that what would have happened is that I would have gone back to sponsoring myself, which is why I found myself in the pickle that I had to ask her to be my sponsor in the first place. But I started calling her once a week, and what happened was, oh my God, we got a relationship. We got to know each other. And I didn't have to give her the backstory. And she wasn't only hearing from me when I was in crisis. She actually could get some perspective on how I walked through life, and that it wasn't always, I wasn't always in a problem. I've had sponsees when the only time they call me is when they're in crisis. I have no idea how they live the rest of their life because we're not talking. So, but it's been such an amazing relationship. She's walked me, we've walked each other through so many things because life happens. I somehow got this idea when I came to AA that it was get sober, get prizes, and that's not been my experience. My experience was get sober, enjoy life, live life on life's terms. So I have a home group. Right now, I'm not claiming my face-to-face home group because we're not sure we're going to go back to face-to-face. But the Global Speakers Group, it's an English-speaking meeting based out of China, is my online home group. It's been my online home group for about 6 years. As Stephen said, I started in online AA in the mid-'80s. And I know that there are some other people. I know Carol had experience with online AA before the world went into a pandemic 18 months ago. And I got involved in online AA by accident. It was just because I was curious about stuff. And I was leaving a meeting. I was living in Washington, D.C. at the time. I was leaving a meeting at, I think, DuPont Circle, and there was a flyer on the bulletin board about this online AA thing. And I had a computer at work that had a modem that I was communicating with my client. And I thought, well, I wonder if I can do AA that way. And so I had somebody show me how to connect, and I got connected with online AA. It wasn't anything like what we have now. We didn't have video. We didn't even, this was before the internet, as Carol will remember. We were in chat rooms on FidoNet. They were privately held networks. And I don't know if Barry made it into the room, but he's got a lot of experience with online AA before in the early days. And And it was absolutely amazing. And then in 2001, of course, the fourth edition came out, and they actually talked about us in the foreword to the fourth edition. They had a whole paragraph about us. And oh my God, the ruckus that raised, it's like, we have always, any of you who have ever been involved in general service know that AA works very slow, very slow. But that fourth edition came out, and that last paragraph to the foreword was published, and people were up. Online AA is not real AA, they said. And they got an agenda item onto the agenda for the following April. And the book was published, I think, in November of 2001, maybe a little bit earlier than that. And they already had an agenda item, and they had one sentence removed from the fourth edition. So if you don't have one of the first three printings of the fourth edition, you're missing a sentence in your paragraph, in your foreword, that says, fundamentally, the difference between an electronic meeting and the home group around the corner is only one of format, which I think we've really proven during the pandemic. So I love online AA, but let me back up and tell you a little bit about what it was like, what happened, how I got here, and what it's like today. I grew up in the Midwest. I grew up in a good family. I had a good childhood. I had religious teachings. I was part of my parents' practice of faith, and my brother and I were taught by religious leaders, and somehow my brother and I were taught by the same religious teachers. We had the same people teaching us, and he heard an entirely different thing than I heard. Somehow what those people were teaching us went in my head, took a walk around, and came out totally different. And I heard about this punishing, angry God, and that's not the God my brother heard about. He heard about a loving, forgiving God, and that's not what I heard. And so I had this relationship with a higher power that I was afraid of God. I was hiding from God. I was just scared, and I just went through life scared. I graduated from high school. I didn't drink it in high school. I didn't know it would have helped. Got engaged at my senior prom, and that's a whole nother story that we don't really need to go into, but basically I've had 3 marriages and 3 divorces, and we can just leave it at that. But I started drinking in my first marriage, and it was magic. And I know this dates me, but I can see some gray hair on the screen, so some of you will understand what I'm talking about. I was a fan of those old movies from the 30s and 40s, and the talkies, at least they were talkies, right? But remember those beautiful actresses, and they had gorgeous hair and these beautiful gowns, and they'd be in those movies, and they'd have a cigarette and a cigarette lighter, and they'd have a drink in a stem glass, and oh my God. And when I took a drink of that drink that I had in that cocktail lounge in New York, it was magic. I suddenly felt like they looked. And the next morning when I was puking my guts out in the toilet, I didn't think of Piper Laurie or Lee Remick in the days of Wine and Roses. I thought I had the flu, and I got the flu a lot when I drank. I was a blackout drinker, and I was a puker. And so most of my story is hearsay. So I'm not going to tell a lot of it. I was talking with somebody earlier today. I was talking with one of my sister sponsees. I don't know how many of you are aware of this new book that's just been published in the past couple of years called Writing the Big Book. It really challenges a lot of things that we've been told about AA history. And one of the things that it challenges is the story that Bill writes in the Big Book about what it was like when Ebby came and called on him. And Ebby told an entirely different story, but so did Lois. Lois's journal tells a totally different story than what Bill shares in the Big Book. And somebody asked Ebby one time, why is your version so different from Bill's version? And Ebby says, well, I was sober. And I think about that, and I think, I tell these stories about when I was drinking. I have no idea if I am telling you the truth. I was not sober. I do not know if I really did those things. Most of those things as a blackout drinker, I was told that I did. I don't remember that I did them. They told me I had a good time. I'm just going to take their word for that. So that's where my drinking started, was in this nice cocktail lounge in New York. And where my drinking took me was I kept drinking in lower and lower places. I sought out lower companions. I was physically ejected from bars. I had a terrible mouth on me. I used foul language when I was drinking. But you know, if I was one of those women drinkers that if I had to pay for more than one drink, I just went to another bar. And I could always get some, if there was a jukebox that played sad country music, I could always get somebody to pay for my drinking. Because all I would do is put a quarter in the jukebox. You used to get 4 or 5 plays for a quarter, and I'd put on sad country music. And then I'd go sit at the bar. And I'd pay for the one drink I was going to pay for, and I'd sit there and I'd play with it and I'd look around. And sooner or later, somebody would come along and they'd put their arm around me and they'd say, there, honey, it can't be that bad. Let me buy you a drink. And I drank in dive bars with surgeons and astronauts and pilots and professors. I was sometimes those things. You were probably sometimes those things if you were drinking in the kinds of bars I drank in, because I could not be honest about anything when I was drinking. I always wanted to be something different than what I was. And what happened for me was I tried all of those things that it talks about in our big book, all of those things that it talks about in chapter 3. I took a trip. I didn't take a trip. I drank only at home. I never drank at home. I swore off with and without a solemn oath. I decided one time that my husband and I had an argument, and he'd called me an alcoholic. And I knew what an alcoholic looked like, because there was some alcoholism in my extended family, not in my immediate family at that time, but in my extended family, I knew what alcoholics looked like. And so I set out to prove that I wasn't an alcoholic. I swore off with and without a solemn oath. And what happened for me was I went through withdrawal. I didn't know it was withdrawal. I didn't know anything about alcoholism. And I thought I was having a nervous breakdown. So I went to see a shrink. He apparently thought that withdrawal from alcoholism was a deficiency of speed in the system, because he prescribed these little white pills. And I took these little white pills the same way that I took anything else. If one is good, 2 are better. And I went back a week later and I explained to the doctor that those pills didn't seem to be working. Maybe there was something else he could give me. And I ran the course on that. And I drank while I was doing that. And I'm not sure my body's ever quite figured that out. I took a trip. I went home to visit my family for a lengthy stay. And this was at the end of my drinking. And I have no idea what that trip must have been like for my family. I came back, I was living in Hawaii at the time. And I came back from that trip, and I had taken more physical exercise. I joined a softball team, and I was a shortstop because I was fast. Well, of course I was fast. I had those little dry goods helping me out there, but I just wasn't very accurate. I'd get to the ball and I'd just kind of stand there and vibrate. And one Sunday morning, I missed an easy field, and my coach pulled me out of the game, and I questioned whether his mother knew who his father was. And I got in my car and I took off out of Kapolani Park, and I drove home. And driving home along Diamond Head Road, I kept thinking that if I could get going fast enough, I could go over the cliff and I could die. But I had not had anything to drink that day. Hadn't had any of those outside issues that day. And I was afraid that at the last minute, I'd pick my foot up off the accelerator and I wouldn't hit that little rock wall hard enough to go over the cliff, and that I wouldn't die, and that I'd just be in pain. And I could no longer conceive of what life would be like with and without alcohol. I was at the jumping off point. And I went home and I fixed myself a drink so that I could kill myself. And before I took that drink, I walked to the back of the house And I picked up the phone and I called information. And I asked for the phone number of Alcoholics Anonymous. And the information operator did not give me the phone number of Alcoholics Anonymous. She connected me with Alcoholics Anonymous. And I am forever grateful for that. I am forever grateful that for whatever reason, that woman just put me right through to AA hotline. And a woman answered the phone. And I told her that I'd like to know something about your program for a friend of mine that I thought might have a problem. Honest from the beginning, folks, you know? And the woman on the phone said, well, why don't you take your friend to a meeting? And I said, oh, my friend would not want to do that. But if you tell me about AA, I can tell my friend about AA. And she started talking about Alcoholics Anonymous, and she mentioned the word God. And I interrupted her and explained to her that I don't believe in God. And she asked if my friend believed in God. So I let her tell me where there was a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. And of course, I didn't want to go to one in my own neighborhood. God forbid my neighbors should see me going into a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. Don't let that happen. And my neighbors had to call the emergency services on me a few weeks before because I was passed out on my front lawn and they thought I was dead. But God forbid, don't let them see me going into an AA meeting. So she told me where there was an AA meeting. It was at the Atkinson Y across from Ala Moana Shopping Center. And I was in a meeting in Honolulu this morning. And I got the woman on the phone and told me to get there early and go up to the first woman I saw. And I got there. I did not get there really early, but I was before the meeting started. And as I walked up to the meeting room, there were a bunch of people out on the lanai and they were drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes and laughing and just having a great time. And I thought, see, that's the kind of party I should be going to. But no, I have to go to Alcoholics Anonymous. So I went up and I went into the meeting room. And what I remember is that there was no one in the room except for back by the coffee pots, one person. Now, I'm not sure that's accurate. I'm just here to tell you this is how I remember my story. And I went up to this woman by the coffee pots, and before I could say anything, I started crying. And she said, "Oh, you're a newcomer." And she took me outside and she introduced me to the women of Alcoholics Anonymous. And the women of Alcoholics Anonymous gave me their phone numbers. And that was a long time ago. I was young and cute in those days. Some of the men gave me their phone numbers, and the women took them away from me. And then they sat me up in the front row between two other women, between Blanche and Connie. And Alan Kay was the chairperson of the meeting. I get to go to meetings with Alan Kay on Sundays at Sunday Aloha in Honolulu on Zoom. And Alan was the chairperson of my very first AA meeting. On Tuesdays, I get to go to a meeting with Connie C., who sat next to me at my very first meeting. Blanche is in an assisted care facility up in Washington State, and I don't get to talk with her anymore. But I still have those people in my life. I still have those connections. And I cried through that first meeting, and I've cried through 43 years. I'm a crier. I just cry for different reasons today. And I sat in that meeting, and when I left that meeting that night, it was a closed meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. I had no idea what that meant. And I was sitting in that room trying to figure out who the alcoholics were. And I left that meeting that night, and I went home. And a week later, I came back because I thought I had joined Sunday night AA. And I walked in, and Blanche, who had been by the coffee pots at my first meeting, came up to me, and she remembered my name. She said, "Penny, it is so great to see you. How many meetings did you get to this week?" And I said, "Well, I was here last Sunday." And she said, "But Penny, during the week, how many meetings did you go to during the week?" And I said, last Sunday, I was here on Sunday. And she went over to the literature rack and she got a meeting schedule and she marked some stuff on it. And she took me out to Renee and to Connie, and she said, "I've marked meetings where I'm going to meet Penny. Would you mark the meetings where you'll meet Penny?" And Connie and Renee marked meetings for me, and they said, "We will meet you at these meetings." And I didn't know that I didn't have to show up. I thought it would be rude to not show up. These people were counting on me being there. They were making an effort to be at these meetings so that they could meet me there. I didn't know they were going to go to those meetings anywhere, anyway, that's the meetings that they were marking. But I went to those meetings, and I'm so lucky. I'm so grateful. I am so grateful that I happened to land in this little pocket of enthusiasm about Alcoholics Anonymous. I happened to land in a group of people that were talking about the big book, that were talking about the steps. We didn't always hear about that back in the 70s and early 80s, before Joe and Charlie and some of the other big book people got it going in the US. But that's what I wound up in. I wound up in this group that talked about the big book, talked about the steps. I used to go to a noon meeting on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays at Queens Hospital. And there were two guys that used to go there, Al and George, and they would quote from the big book. And it'd be during the meeting, and one of them would get called on, and they'd say, no matter what the topic was, they had a quote from the book. They'd say, well, like it says on page 53 in the big book, and then they'd quote something. But they told the page number. So I'd go home and I'd look up page 53 in the big book. And if they hadn't been accurate, I would go back and I would tell them that they had misquoted the big book. And they told me later that they quoted from the big book just to get me to read it. I'm retired now. I retired as an editor, and my very first copy of the big book, Bill is very redundant in his writing. I've had a conversation with Bill Schauberg about this, the guy who wrote Writing the Big Book. His writing is repetitious. He really does a lousy job with punctuation. And so my very first copy of the big book is redlined throughout the book. I have diagrammed sentences in my very first big book because Bill had such poor sentence structure. And Bill, or Hank Parkhurst, one of them. And but I would go to meetings. There was I didn't get, well, I tried sponsorship, and the woman that I got for a sponsor was incapable of keeping a confidence and shared something at group level that I had shared with her. So now I didn't trust her, and I didn't trust any of the other, I knew what women were like in the bars, and I wasn't sure that you were any different in these rooms. So, and I brought a lot of bar behavior into these rooms. I did not get real well real fast. I was just one of those irritating newcomers. I think back to what I was like as a newcomer, and I am so grateful for the long timers that were around that just had so much patience and tolerance with me when I was new. But there was one woman I used to call Fran R, and Fran had, I think, 22 years when I got sober, and I'd get myself in a jam, and I'd call Fran, and I'd tell her what was going on, and Fran would say things to me like, boy, Penny, that's a really tough one. I don't know what to do about that one. But I think that's in the big book. Why don't you try reading? And then she'd give me 5 to 8 pages to read. She'd say, why don't you try reading page 62 to 70 in the book? And I'd read it. It was exactly what I needed. And then I'd call her another time and I'd tell her what was going on. And she'd say, wow, I don't know about that one. But I think if you try reading why don't you try 35 to 40? Oh my God, it was amazing. And I asked Fran one time how she knew the book so well. And she said, oh, honey, I don't know the book that well, but you're so selfish and self-centered. I give you 5 to 10 pages to read. You're going to find yourself in there somewhere. And I always did, and I still do. I can tell you that during the pandemic, there have been times when I've just been totally confused about what's going on. And I open the big book and I read 5 to 10 pages, and it doesn't matter if it's in the text or if it's in the stories. I am still so selfish and self-centered. I find myself in there, I love those meetings now and there seem to be a lot of them online where, you read a couple paragraphs out of out of anywhere out of our AA big book or 12 and 12, and then you talk about it for 5 to 10 minutes, and then there's a discussion. And I love it that, you know, you can pick any 2 or 3 paragraphs out of the book and people can talk about it for an hour to 90 minutes. They've got no problem. So I know I'm not the only selfish, self-centered person sitting in these rooms. When I had about, I didn't work the steps right away. I don't recommend that for anybody. I looked at the steps. I didn't think the steps really applied to me. I was kind of afraid that the steps weren't going to work for me. And I'd taken the alcohol and the outside issues out of me, and I'd not really replaced them with anything. I was angry at God. I thought I didn't believe in God, but what I came to understand through taking the steps, putting the steps into practice, is that I was hiding from God, but I didn't have that information at that time. And I think back to those early days when I was new in the program, and I really know that I get to be here by seconds and inches. There were so many times when I thought I had a better plan, but for whatever reason, I went to a meeting and I sat down next to somebody that insisted that I go to coffee with them after the meeting and go to the meeting after the meeting and all of that stuff. But at about 15 months of sobriety, I came to a place where I could no longer resist God's will working in my life. God had put a woman in my life that was visiting from the mainland, and I thought it was some bad breaks and some misunderstandings that she wound up staying in my home for a week. And I know now that it was just the grace of God, because I thought Kay was a whole new audience for my terrible tale of war. I had a bad story. I had a bad story. And I started to tell Kay my bad story. And Kay would listen for a little while, and then I'd take a breath, and Kay would say, Penny, that's interesting information, but you're an alcoholic and you haven't taken the steps. And it was clear to me that Kay was not paying attention. So I would tell her more of my bad story. And Kay would listen for a little bit, and then she'd say, well, you know, that's interesting information, Penny, but you are an alcoholic and you have not taken the steps. So the first time I took the steps, I took them to prove that they would not work for me. And I am here to share with you that the steps don't know who's working them. The steps just work. And the steps, I can tell you that I've been sober for 43 years. I have done the steps more than once. I know some people believe that you only do them once and then you stay sober at 10, 11, and 12. If I was still trying to stay sober on that first 4 step, you'd have somebody else sitting in this chair. And my experience has been that the steps don't know how many times I've worked them before. The steps of Alcoholics Anonymous just work. The steps don't know how long I'm sober. The steps don't know what my gender is. They don't know what my race is. They don't know what my sexual orientation is. The steps do not care. The steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, in my experience, just work. And I am so grateful for that. I had a sponsor. Kay helped me find a sponsor. I actually had a sponsor by then, but she was in a coma, which again is one of those stories that's just for another time. But Kay helped me find a sponsor that, as she put it, was actively going to meetings. And she helped me find someone who practiced, who believed that the solution to my problem was in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And so I started working with this sponsor who took me through the big book. We started at the very beginning of the book. And from the very beginning, she had me find prayers, promises, and principles as we went through the book. And I'm so grateful for that, because I learned that there's lots of prayers in the big book, that if it says we ask, that's prayer. And so I get lots of prayers as I'm going through the book. I get promises. I don't have to wait until the 9th step to get promises. There are promises from the very beginning of the book, and principles. Now, yes, the 12 steps are principles, and the 12 traditions are principles, 12 concepts are principles, but I'm talking about principles that I need to put into practice in my life on a daily basis, like humility, like honesty, like willingness, like integrity, and responsibility, taking responsibility for my actions and not saying, oh, well, it's not my fault, but taking responsibility for those actions. When I'm making amends, how am I changing my behavior? Not just saying I'm sorry. And so I had this sponsor that had me find the prayers, the promises, and the principles as we went through each step, so that when we got to that 12th step and it says, practice these principles in all our affairs, I didn't have to say, what are you talking about? What principles? Because I had them. I had them written down. When we did the 4th step, she told me that there's 5 prayers in step 4. Well, I could easily find the one where we pray for the sick man and where we pray for the right ideal. And for a long time, the sick man had been my right ideal, but that's not what we were talking about here. Again, if it says we ask, that's prayer, and that there's one prayer in the fears portion and 1 prayer in the resentments portion and 3 prayers in the sex portion, not judging, just reporting. But, and as we did that step, as I wrote my 4th step, and I got to that part where it says we ask, that I put my pen down and I prayed. And that invited God in. And again, I was still praying to somebody else's God. I was still using a group of drunks. I will tell you that even now, with as much sobriety as I have, that there's times when I'm not really sure about that God thing. And a friend of mine passed away earlier this year from COVID, my friend Jim J. And Jim would have had 49 years sober this past summer. And Jim introduced me to Gus, the great universal spirit. And the big book talks about it. I think it's on page 52 in our big book, but you'd have to check that because I could be wrong. And where it talks about the universal spirit. And so I often talk to Gus. I find it easier to talk to Gus than to talk to God. And it's just the same thing for me. It's just what I happen to call God today. That's not always been the case. But I started going through those steps, and I wrote that 4th step, and I sat down with that sponsor, and I was so afraid to share that 5th step with her. And I'm so grateful that God gave me someone to share a 5th step with that was not judgmental, that did not recoil in horror at any of the things I shared, that shared some of the things that she had done that she was so afraid for people to know. And my experience has been, in the time that I've been sober, there's absolutely nothing that has happened to me, nothing that I have done, that I have not been able to find another woman in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous that has not walked that same path and has stayed sober. But also, I've been lucky enough to be able to put, many of us are familiar with that phrase or the paragraph on page 124. This is, cling to the thought that in God's hands, our dark past is the greatest possession we have. With it, we can save other people's lives. That's not an exact quote. You'll have to look it up. You can correct me. But I've also been given the gift of being able to be there for other women when they've been walking through tough times. And I've been able to say, I've been there, and this is what I had to do. These are the actions I had to take to get through that situation. I got married in sobriety. I got divorced in sobriety. And because of the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, when my husband and I got divorced, we managed to be able to be best friends until the day he died. And he would have had 57 years of sobriety this year. And he was a good man. And I'm so grateful that I got to trudge part of the path with him. And I've been so lucky in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. I've had hard times and I've had good times. There have been times when I just didn't think I could get through it, but it never occurred to me to take a drink. When my mom was dying, when my sister died of our disease. And I'd had my sister, she was my older sister. I'd had her all my life. And I'd gotten her to an AA meeting, and I'd gotten her to an Al-Anon meeting. And I was devastated when she died, and I was angry when she died. Why did I get AA and my sister couldn't have AA? And again, people who have trudged the path before us gave me the answers. And my sponsor directed me. I'd lived in Washington, D.C. for a while, and well, I'd lived there. I'd had the privilege of going to meetings and sharing a home group with Sandy B. And Sandy's daughter was murdered just about the same time that my sister passed away. And Peg called me up one day and she said, you know, Sandy spoke at our conference this weekend. I think you need to listen to his message. And I sat down and listened to Sandy's message. Not right away, of course. It took me a couple months to listen to Sandy's CD. But, you know, Sandy talked about forgiveness, and he talked about moving forward. And I was able to do that. And it may not seem like much, but it was huge. It was so huge. And I've had the opportunity to you know, as Stephen said at the beginning, to be active in online AA. I've known people around the world. My online home group is an English speaking meeting out of China. It's been my online home group for about 6 years now. We use WebEx. We don't use Zoom. It's just a different platform. It's a lot the same on signing in, but we're also audio only because we're coming out of China. And so we don't always have bandwidth, and in order to get good reception for our audio, we don't use any video. And it's really interesting to sit in this meeting with people from around the world and just listen to what people are sharing and not have the video to distract me. And yet at other times when I'm speaking like this, I'm so grateful for the people who have their videos turned on that I can see you. I'm not just talking to a black screen. It is hard on at my home group sometimes if you're the chairperson and you're sharing and it's like I'm talking to my living room wall. But I've gotten to travel with Alcoholics Anonymous. I was still working when I got sober, and I was in a meeting. I was down in Texas on business in Amarillo, Texas. I was this one happened in Louisiana, New Orleans, Louisiana. I called the hotline and I asked if they had anybody on their hotline that could pick me up from my hotel and get me to a meeting, because I was traveling with 8 men from my company. I was the only female in the group, and we had 2 cars. And of course, they always wanted to go out drinking and dinner in the evenings, and I just wanted to get to an AA meeting, but they needed both cars. And so I called the hotline and I said, do you have anybody that'll pick somebody up at a hotel and get her to a meeting? And he said, oh, I know just the person. And this woman came and picked me up. She was driving a white on white Cadillac convertible, and she's in platinum blonde in a white jumpsuit. And we had to stop at 7-Eleven on the way to get her a red Big Gulp. I had to hold on to that Big Gulp on the way to the meeting, thinking, oh my God, if this spills, it's going to go all over this white car. And we got to the meeting. My client was the greeter at the door. It was like, oh, what now? And I stepped back into the shadows, but he'd already seen me. And he stepped forward and he came up and he gave me a big hug. And in that wonderful Cajun accent of his, he said, I knew there was something about you I liked. And we sat in the meeting, and the next day he came into my office and he said, hey, there's a noon meeting. You want to go? So we went to the meeting, and on the way back, we went through a drive-through, picked up red beans and rice for lunch. And a couple days later, he said, hey, there's a meeting. You want to go? And so we went to a meeting. On the way back from the meeting, we pulled through a drive-through and I don't know, got a Schlotzsky's or something, ate it at our desk when we got back. My boss came into my office that afternoon and he closed the office door and he sat down across the desk from me and he looked at me and said, you know, Brian is married. And I said, we're just going to lunch with friends. He said, you're gone for an hour and you eat at your desk when you get back. So after that, we picked up lunch on the way to the meeting. But, you know, I've had great adventures. I got to go to Poland a few years ago to do a step study, step and tradition study and workshop. And I got to go to Warsaw. I got to go to this little village of Bełchatów that is just this wonderful little village. And I got to go to Krakow. And my grandmother's family is from Auschwitz, which is out where Auschwitz is located outside of Krakow. And so while I was in Krakow, I went out to Auschwitz and I got to go on a tour of Auschwitz. And for any of you who have ever been on a tour of any of the camps in Europe, you know, many of the ends of the tours end at one of the gas chambers. And they gave us the opportunity to go into the chamber if we wanted. And I took advantage of that. I don't know why I decided to do it, but I did. And I walked in to that gas chamber and it changed my life. I will never again refer to anybody as a step Nazi or a big book Nazi, because those are words of hate. And this isn't a program of hate. This is a program of love. And I can't even explain how it gave me this whole new perspective on the life that I've been given. Just before the pandemic, I got to go to Moldova, which is a small country used to be in the Soviet Union. It's between the Ukraine and Romania. They speak Russian and Romanian in Moldova. It's the poorest country in Europe and has the highest incidence of alcoholism of any country in Europe, in any country in the world, according to the World Health Organization. And AA is 30 years old there. It's directly descended. If any of you ever had anything to do with AA going to Russia, AA in Moldova is directly related to the message that we were able to carry, the 12-step work that we were able to carry to the Kremlin and into Moscow. Because the two people that founded AA in Moldova got sober in a treatment facility in Moscow and then brought the message back to Moldova, to Kishinev. And AA is 30 years old in Moldova. They just celebrated their 30th year this past August. And I got to go online to their anniversary celebration. 30 years AA has been in Moldova. There's only about 100 people sober in Moldova. And, you know, it's just, and we are so lucky, you know, even now, you know, we have meetings whenever we want them. But even before the pandemic, you know, we have a selection of meetings to choose from, most of us. And people that are talking about recovery, that are working the steps, that carry a message. We have long timers that are trudging the path ahead of us, that tell us, share their experience, strength, and hope. And that's, you know, that's my job today. I've loved being on Zoom. You know, when the world closed down 18 months ago, and we were able to start up within a couple of days. We had meetings online for everybody. We were so glad y'all came along, weren't we, Carol? It was just so great. You know, come join us. We know. And we know how the message can be carried, and to watch people get sober in online meetings in the past 18 months, all of the Zoom babies that have never been to a face-to-face meeting. I sit in meetings sometimes with people who complain about Zoom meetings, and it's like, are you kidding? People are getting sober here. Lives are being saved. And I am so grateful for that. And my sponsor requires that I have a service commitment. It's hard to have a service commitment during COVID, isn't it? And I had to find a service commitment. And I started doing a web page that, you know, Stephen found his service commitment with the Ponderables, and I found my service commitment. I have a web page where I post flyers for AA meetings and events around the world. And what that does is it gets me, all these flyers go past my desk, and Deb Swartz knows, because she's one of the people that I connect with for flyers, and Carol connects me with flyers. And so I have this, oh my God, this wide selection of meetings to go to. I see Elizabeth is here also. Thank you, Elizabeth. I love you too. There's the National AA Technology Workshop is this weekend. It does cost $5 to register, but it is AA in a changing time. And you know, if you're interested in the flyer, I'll put my information in the chat box, and I'll make sure that Stephen has it to post, to send out with Ponderables as well. But you know, I'm so grateful for the message of Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm so grateful that 43 years ago, I was so sick that I thought, I was going to go to this meeting to help this friend, this imaginary friend of mine, and it saved my life. And I'm so grateful for the people that were around. On Tuesdays, this California gal somehow wound up with a service commitment in Brooklyn, New York on Tuesdays. And I get to sit in that meeting with my friend Connie C. That was at my first meeting, sat next to me at my very first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. My friend Jolene is part of my online home group with the Global Speakers Group. And Jolene and I have known each other since she got sober in June of 78. So we've known each other over 43 years and we've been friends for all of that time. We've been in touch for those 43 years. And I get to have that because of people like you that carry the message where you are. People like you that reach out and do what we've been told that we're supposed to be doing, that we carry the message and that we reach out to the suffering alcoholic, and that we never know where the suffering alcoholic is sitting. She's not always sitting in the newcomer's chair. Sometimes she's sitting in my chair. And I don't even know that until I hear something in a meeting. So I'm grateful to be here, grateful that Stephen asked me to come and share with you this evening. And thank you so much.